Okay, I think we are live.
Hi.
Welcome. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you doing this afternoon or evening?
Good. Yeah, it's I'm here in Toronto, so East Coast, so we're just hitting 6 o'clock. But for those tuning in, welcome. Thank you for joining. We will be this will be live on our site afterwards. So if you have to pop out, no worries, you can tune in later. But I'm really excited to have Dr. Brittany Linton join us this evening. Dr. Linton's located in San Francisco, and I wanted to welcome you. For those that are tuned in, my name is Mary-Lyn. You might have seen my face before. I've been doing a few of these live streams, but I'm one of the directors for Made of Millions Foundation, located here in Toronto. So I'll turn it over to you if you want to just tell us a little bit about yourself and a bit of an intro.
Sure. So, hello, everyone. So nice to be joining you wherever you are and through whatever device you're using. My name is Dr. Brittany Linton. As Mary Lynn said, I live in San Francisco, California, where I currently practice as a clinical psychologist. Part of my key background is that I'm an integrated health psychologist, which means I'm working with people directly in medical rooms a lot of the time. But before all of that, I've done a lot of work in resiliency and positive psychology and how we can each better ourselves to combat the stressors of the world and find ways to bounce back from hardship. So we're really excited to have this conversation today.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, we've chatted off, a few times, and I've always really enjoyed chatting with you. So I hope that we're able to bring some insight to the audience, especially during this time that's been challenging for everyone. So I know, with the title of this session, we've called it quarantine fatigue. I know I've definitely felt it. Probably, I would say last week for myself. I know that you've been hearing a lot from clients and friends and family that people are kind of hitting a wall. Can you share a bit about what you've been hearing and what you've been seeing, and kind of paint a picture before we look at some of the coping tools we can start implementing?
Absolutely. So one of the things I really appreciate is that, Mary-Lyn, you and I have had a few different conversations related to coronavirus and how it has definitely impacted all of our lives in varying ways. And you and I were actually going to do a completely different talk at one point in time, but then something really happened about 2 weeks ago. And I noticed that amongst my patients that I serve and amongst my friends and family members, that people were hitting a wall. People were talking more about needing to get outside more. They were being less protective in many of their measures. They were just tired. They were experiencing this utter exhaustion in their day to day. And so what it really caused me to do is take a step back and think, what has it been like that so many of us have drastically shifted our world for over 60 days, depending on where you are in the in North America or elsewhere in the world. Many of us have been in some type of shelter in place, stay in place attempt for over 60 days. And so, as many of you might have heard in the last few weeks, this buzzword of quarantine fatigue has been kind of zipping around the interwebs. And what does that mean? I can share personally, it means I'm tired of baking banana bread. I'm really tired of baking banana bread. I can also share that it means that as it gets progressively sunnier outside, as we're heading at the tail end of spring and into summer, that the pull to be outside in sunshine is much stronger than the pull to remain inside. And many of my friends and colleagues have chatted about that. And then from my patients and clients I have a chance to serve, many of them have been just talking about they're tired of being afraid and they're tired of being scared. And so what does that mean when you're just tired of being tired? And so we're seeing this whole shift happen.
Yeah. And, obviously there's been a lot of information coming at us. And I know a lot of people are saying they're kind of, limiting the amount of news that they're watching, but at the same time, tuning in to know what the latest restrictions are and the latest news. And so we're constantly having to shift, in terms of, okay, now we're not in complete lockdown. I mean, obviously, depending on where you are, that our government was encouraging us to go outside a couple of weeks ago, and whereas before it was like stay home. So how are people I guess, what advice have you been giving to friends, family, patients on taking in all of this news and the continuous shift of restrictions and having a bit of freedom and then, it being taken away again?
Right. It's really interesting, right? Because it felt like for a long time, and to this day, in fact, that every single day we were receiving a new piece of information, as you were saying. And it meant that what I had planned for tomorrow might be completely overturned. And I have to completely change my preparation cycle to leave my home or to stay home or whatever it might be. And that's putting us in this continual state of responsiveness. It makes it really difficult for many of us to plan forward for any significant amount of time. So one of the pieces of advice I've been giving to many friends is I'm not planning my life personally. I'm suggesting for others and for myself, I don't plan my life for more than 2 weeks out. And that's so hard. Like that is such an incredible burden to place upon ourselves when we're so used to thinking forward, thinking in the future, not only months ahead, but sometimes years ahead of where we think we will be. But it's really causing myself and others to take a pause on what we're demanding of ourselves and plan for no more than 1 or 2 weeks at a time.
Yeah.
One of the other pieces, when you're asking about how do we just ingest all the news that's being thrown at us and all of the changes that are occurring, there's this suggestion that we just take it bit by bit. And I know that also the term of news hygiene has been floating around a lot more. But thinking about making sure you're not feeling overwhelmed with all of the demands placed upon you, but also not putting your head in the sand either and ignoring all news content. And how that shapes for each person is very different, but just being really cautious and thoughtful towards how much do you take in, how much do you actually begin prescribing to yourself, and then what do you leave on the table because you don't have control over it. And what I generally recommend to people is that if there's a piece of news that is really outside the bounds of your immediate control, it might be informational for you to have and beneficial. But if you're just taking in too much of it that is outside the bounds of your control, just let it be after you get that initial headline and clip of understanding.
Okay. And then, I know some individuals that have underlying mental health conditions are obviously being really triggered right now. And then individuals that haven't really suffered in the past, maybe they're experiencing some depression, obviously anxiety, for different reasons, whether it's, there's just more pressures on them to look after, if they're a single mother and they're looking after 3 children while also trying to work and do all of that. What about that kind of group of people and kind of hitting this point where typically the recommendations for that are to, go and do exercise, get into social circles, like all of these things that people can't actually do right now. And so I'd imagine this like quarantine fatigue that a lot of people are hitting, especially if they're in that situation, being more vulnerable and being more susceptible to symptoms of depression, for example, that's particularly challenging.
It's absolutely challenging. I'm going to actually pause this really quick and take a quick step back for us to redefine what quarantine fatigue means, because again, it's something that's just cropped up in popular culture and discussion in the last few weeks. And I think what I've observed when I've read all the news articles is that there's 2 different types of quarantine fatigue. So I invite everyone to think about which camp do you fall in right now, and it might be both camps, and maybe you don't fall in either, but which camp do you kind of fall into? So quarantine fatigue on one hand might be this utter degree of frustration at the sheer amount of restrictions and life adjustments you've had to make. And it's this hitting the breaking point of, I just can't keep putting on a mask every day and putting Purell on my hands ad nauseum. And I'm just so tired of it all. And it's this frustration and irritability that we see creeping forward, and people wanting to balk at the rules and balk against the rules a little bit more. The other type of quarantine fatigue I also have observed and seen in myself and others is that you are physically and emotionally exhausted at the end of the day, because it might be because of maybe the constant news onslaught, as you were discussing earlier, or making all those fine-tuned choices every day. Or it just might be that if you are able to stably work right now, you might be on back-to-back Zoom meetings. Or if you're at home and you don't have childcare provided for you, you are running around chasing kiddos in the midst of trying to do everything else you're attempting to do in life. Either way, those are 2 sets of core stressors. So one is just frustration and irritability at the restrictions that we've had to make in life. And the other one is there's so many new demands in my life that I was never anticipating that makes it really hard. And social isolation falls in that too. Yeah. So that's the fatigue breakdown. How you address those is very different depending on what type of fatigue symptom set you're experiencing. So that's why I wanted to take that step back.
Yeah, no, that's great. And yeah, thanks for clarifying that, because that clarified something for me as well. And I think it's true. I think it's, you could be in both. Like I kind of think I
Absolutely.
might be in both
Uh-huh.
categories, right?
I am. Yep.
So yeah, and I think I only hit the first one being like really frustrated with things last week because, you know, I had gone to see family, my parents, and, you know, I couldn't go close to them. And there was this whole thing, and, you know, I couldn't even touch like a glass. And, you know, it was just like this um, reality kind of hit of,
Yeah.
okay, like I'm with my parents and like they're allowing us to be in groups of 5 or whatever it is, but I still, there's all these restrictions and I feel like very, you know, like, and then you deal with the guilt the next day of, did I make the right decision? Even though
Mhm.
they're giving you the okay to do something like that, depending on where you live, you then have to experience potentially guilt the next day. So
Absolutely. And I appreciate mentioning the guilt thing that is coming up because I might have shared this with you on one of our other talks, but I joke with friends now that I have this daily kind of COVID calculator I'm doing in my mind. And how I describe the COVID calculator personally, it's what precautions am I willing to take today? And then also what risks am I willing to take today? And then at the end of the day, do I feel that I've done better social good or social harm? And then what degree of guilt am I going to feel at the choice of my personal actions each day? And so
mhm.
that guilt of how do I be in company and community with people? And when I even attempt to do that, it has all this moral choice points around it as well that makes it really difficult. And guilt can definitely be a
Yeah.
part of it.
Can you repeat that? I really liked that.
The COVID calculator
Yeah.
by Dr. Brittany, which is not formally approved anywhere, is you making the choice each day with what degree of precautions you're willing to take, what risks you're willing to take, and how will that equate to either your idea of personal social good or social harm. And when you think about the social, so every day that I choose to securely stay in my home and I never interact with another human being, I'm taking high level precautions, low levels of risks. It equates to high levels of perceived social good and low levels of perceived social harm. I have a pretty guilty free day.
Mhm.
Other days, like over this weekend, for those in the United States, many of us just had a 3-day holiday weekend celebrating Memorial Day. And I spent most of those 3 days, I'll be honest, I spent most of those 3 days outside in nature. And I spent some of it with truly friends at social distance. A good friend pulled out a tape measure to make sure that we were all 6 feet apart with our blankets. No joke.
Mhm.
But I had a mask on and I was sitting outside or I went hiking with a mask on. Again, my precautions were pretty good. My risk taking was higher though than when I choose to sit solitarily in my home. And then my social good was questionable, and my social harm impact might have gone up. And so it's more of a guilt-ridden choice on my part. So that's
Mhm.
what I call my Corona calculator.
Yeah,
And
and I think we all ultimately have to make decisions for ourselves, right? Like we can
absolutely,
only rely so much on what we're being told, and then
yeah,
once we're told that, we then have to make our own decisions um, based on, you know, I guess our own moral code or whatever it is,
yeah,
and if something is worth taking the risk or not. Um, I before we kind of again go to like the building the resiliency,
yeah,
I the last time we chatted, we talked a lot about like what's actually cognitively going on, and so I
yeah.
wanted to dive into that a little bit. Um, with I don't know if it's cognitive conditioning or what's really happening in the brain right now, because I know over a period of time, like we probably are getting used to this new normal, or at least our physical mental state is getting used to this new normal, I'd imagine. But
Absolutely.
any insight on, you know, what's going on? We talked about the reward system in one of our conversations, which I thought was really interesting. This whole idea of, you know, like for me, not necessarily enjoying some of the simple pleasures that I usually have at home because
Right.
there I have access to those simple pleasures a lot more than I would have before.
Yeah, yeah. So, what's going on in the brain right now is twofold. One of the things that we saw really early on was this immediate stress experience that we saw this uptick in anxiety, we saw this uptick in depression, and that's all normal. We would expect it. We would expect to see something like that because of a major threat that has approached and made itself known in our day-to-day lives. What we're seeing as it relates to quarantine fatigue in particular is that we're beginning to see the fatigue aspect of it. And what I mean by that is that when you first experience some type of stressful response, your body ratchets it up, all of its response systems, it's getting prepared to do whatever it needs to do. And then after it has appraised that the threat is gone or that the threat is less than it needs to be and that things are good, it begins to deregulate and move down, and it feels better. And usually people experience a state of exhaustion around that. And there are healthy states of stress and there are unhealthy states of stress. What we're saying in the mental health community is that we think part of the aspect of quarantine fatigue, of people being frustrated and tired, is mainly because their body and brain has been on hypervigilance now for over 60 days.
Yeah.
And that is not a sustainable practice for our brain system. It actually leads to this form of toxic stress. It's also called allostatic load. But it leads to this form of toxic stress where you're having continual exposure to the idea of a threat where the threat is real, but the threat is also not seen, and you cannot remain on 24-hour high incident alert for that long. And so part of that fatigue that we're seeing is people beginning to downregulate and their body actually beginning to say, you know, I got used to what's happening. I think I can tackle this. I don't actually see an immediate threat around me. I'm going to tell my circuit system to now move into a lower gear and say that it's okay. And that's why we're seeing that people are beginning to reduce some of their precautionary efforts, or they're just tired. And so it's because of one, their body and brain is just beginning to get used to the new normal, or their body and brain is beginning to really not slack, but beginning to very much slow down under all of the pressure to maintain a high alert system for so long. And then the great thing about you saying the reward system has changed is that Mary-Lyn and I were chatting about how when we have a chance to go home at the end of a workday, it's a reward for you to sit on your couch and watch Netflix, or it's a reward for many people to go to the gym and work out for an hour, right? Or it's a reward to have a home cooked meal, and that maybe that is your great escape. All of those things we're now doing all of the time in the comfort of our own homes. And so what used to be a reward has now been changed because our brain is now conditioned to just see it as a normalcy. It's not novel, it's not new, it's not exciting any longer. So the things that used to give us pleasure in our home are no longer giving us pleasure. And you're seeing the same thing too happen with quarantine fatigue, is that the exact same idea that people were so excited to get all the household projects done around their house. Oh, these 2 weeks at home are such a great opportunity for me to reorganize my pantry, or it's a great time for me to spend quality time with my kids and do art projects we've put off for years. All of those initial reward systems with the first 2 or 3 weeks of quarantine efforts or stay in place efforts, even in the midst of high levels of stress and anxiety, those initial reward mechanisms have now become boring to many of us. I don't really want to do another jigsaw puzzle. I really don't want to. So I got into watercoloring during all of this. I really am struggling to bring myself to do another meditative watercoloring exercise for the 4th time in 1 week. Whereas once this beautiful luxury and escape, it's now becoming known. And so my brain and your brain becomes really quickly attunes to what it knows and then doesn't see it as anything remarkable. And so it's doing it on a positive way in terms of no longer seeing the virus threat, not a positive way. It's doing it on one hand by seeing the virus threat as no longer remarkable if you're habituating that way. And it's not seeing your daily kind of benefits and rewards as remarkable either.
Yeah, I find that so fascinating.
It's cool. Okay, so I think it's cool because I like the brain and I like our biochemical responses, and I like to know what is happening chemically and physiologically for us in the midst of our thoughts and emotions and experiences. But I know not everyone thinks it's as cool.
Yeah, I mean, I'm there with you. I mean, I didn't study all of that, but I love brain stuff. I love to actually learn how it all works. So we're potentially, a lot of us are hitting this quarantine fatigue. I do want to talk about a couple of other things, but I think the next place we'll go is like, what do we do?
What do we do?
Yeah, like so there's so much uncertainty. No one knows when it's going to be done. Some people are getting news that their workplace is going to be working remote for the next however long, a year or 2 years, I've heard with some companies. Other people, they don't know when their kids are going back to school. Like, everyone is struggling for different reasons, and the uncertainty is in the air for, depending on their situation. So given what we can control and given our environments that we're in, what can we do?
I always love to remind people first and foremost that you have faced a hardship before in life. It doesn't matter what degree or severity that hardship is. I almost guarantee you that most adults and most young adults and even most teenagers and adolescents have faced some type of hardship. You might not have had all of the skills and tools on board that you might have hoped for, but you've come out the other side in some way that shaped you. So what I have been encouraging many people to do is just take a step back and recognize how you've even gotten to this point in your journey, because when you've faced a challenge, you've found your way to the other side in some level of success and survivorship. So first is, what have you already done before? The second difficulty, though, in terms of how we cobble this all together, is that even a lot of the skills and strategies we've used before might not actually be really useful to us now. You were making mention about how, maybe a way that someone has dealt with feelings of depression before and helping manage it is that they would go to their Zumba classes with all of their friends at the gym or the community center, where they got to see people, be around people, and move their body and sweat. And that might not be as available to them now. So how do we find ways to use our old tools, maybe shift them and apply them in new ways? I was using this analogy with a friend that when you're in a therapeutic experience or a mental health well-being experience, we oftentimes will tell you, we're trying to help you build as many tools as possible in your toolbox, so that way you can build yourself a house, a really stable, secure house and foundation. I've now been making the analogy that, yes, we asked you to build a house, but right now we need you to stop building a house. We actually need you to build a life raft over here. And so it might require completely different tool sets. So being open to creating new tool sets is really important.
Yeah.
But when it comes to creating the spirit of resiliency, aside from taking stock of where you've come from and what you've done already and recognizing you are going to have to adapt and do new things, most of us already after the 60-day mark have taken on new strategies. What have been your strategies? Is something to take a serious appraisal of to see, have some of those strategies been successful for you, or have you gotten sick of others? Again, I really loved watercolor painting the first dozen times. I'm a little tired of it, but I'm also trying to make it a practice that I can still draw upon when I need to and I'm ready for it. I'm curious to know, what kind of resiliency or coping have you maybe done for yourself? If you don't, I didn't warn you that I might put you back on the spot.
Oh no, that's fine. Yeah,
I'd be curious to know what you've done.
Happy to. And just to mention to the audience, if you do have any questions, we're here chatting away, but please send us a question and we'll be happy to answer. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely shifted over the last however long it's been. Recently, the weather here in Toronto has really gotten a lot nicer. So I have a dog, so taking her for walks a few times a day, and actually like being present on my walks. I live in quite an interesting neighborhood, and there's a lot of kind of renovations and different things going on in different houses. And so I love to look at houses. So I kind of have been enjoying that. And then
actually, like noticing the architecture in your environment a lot more.
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't interrupt you, but I've noticed the same thing.
Yeah, just like noticing certain things and walking up and discovering streets. Like I've always had to take my dog for a walk, but discovering streets I haven't come across before. Cooking, definitely, but like I'm getting tired of that. Like I'm getting tired of food generally. Like I don't, nothing, no, like I just want pizza.
Yeah.
And then I've been doing this workout video. I would recommend it to anybody. It's called The Class by Taryn Toomey. And it's like a bit of dance, a bit of meditation, a bit of like strength training. And I can release a lot of pent up anxiety, energy, stress, whatever. And it's just a good way. And I feel that with walking too. Like I can feel it in my body, whatever it is. And I just need to like move. And so for me, it's been like more of these physical outlets right now. But I also enjoy doing like things with my hands and stuff like that. I just haven't been recently.
Yeah. I'm really happy that you mentioned the physical outlets of walking or taking your dog out, or even I've been encouraging people, make sure you are standing once an hour. I mean, it really is imperative, because when we talk about this idea of stress and toxic stress, there actually is good for you stress. there is a level of stress that actually helps bolster your resiliency, both your psychological resiliency and your actual physiological resiliency that helps with your immune response. And some of the things that help both responses in your system is that you take deeper breaths versus shallow breaths, that you move your body on a regular basis and you're not remaining so sedentary, and that you also have fluctuations in your temperature, including hot environments and cooler environments, not that you're staying stagnant in one temperature throughout the day. And it sounds like I'm just giving a basic prescription for go out and do physical activity, but actually I want you to think about, I want you and everyone else to think about it. Think about it that every time that we are forcing our brain and body to respond in a new way, that is a microdose of stress. And that's a positive stress that we're placing upon ourselves.
Yeah.
But every time we ask our bodies and our brains to sit in this stagnant pool of stress that we're not seeing any shifts around, that is that toxic stress load that we're placing on ourselves. And especially when people are doing shallow breathing, I catch myself, I notice I have been breathing in a far more shallow way than I was before. And so I've been forcing myself to take deeper breaths to make sure I can really oxygenate my brain and also just move my system around a bit more. Now, I want to take a quick pause. I hope you guys can't hear it, but I live right near a hospital, so there is a fire alarm or emergency vehicle going by, so apologies if that disrupts it. But
I did hear it, but I was picturing San Francisco, which I love. Although I don't know where you live there, but
well, picture it more as like that's the fire alarm of toxic stress, and you want to take some deep breaths to help with bringing yourself back into a space of calm and collection.
yeah. No, I like that. This the workout that I've been doing with it's called The Class, and it's all about with the strength training, for example. There's like a lot of repetitive kind of movements or whatever, and obviously eventually your muscles are starting to hurt. And the whole kind of philosophy is like to feel that pain and really get inside your body. Absolutely. But how are you going to react to it? Are you going to stop? Are you going to like give up? And so they take it back to like building resiliency, like while you're working out, but then into your regular life as well. Like you've had a bad day, like, are you going to give up and just like quit? Or are you going to kind of like feel those emotions, feel that stress, feel that anxiety, let it pass through you and keep going?
I mean, what you're talking about is emotional endurance, right? I mean, it's this entire idea that you build up physical endurance. You have to actually practice a skill. You have to build up the muscle mass. And we can build endurance and stamina and resilience to allow us to go longer, fight harder, whatever it may be. And we do the same being. And when we can learn to tolerate feelings of discomfort, when we can learn to just hold an experience of maybe sadness or unfamiliarity without judging it, without trying to change it, when we can do that, we build up our emotional resilience, our emotional endurance, and our emotional stress response.
Yeah.
Over the weekend, so as I shared, I was hiking this past weekend. One of the things I'm trying to take up is trail running. It's quite interesting because I love to hike, but I want to go faster on the hikes. That's part of it. But I just thought trail running would be a lot of fun. And as I was running down a trail, I kind of realized that like any skill in life, you need a few different basic building blocks. And it's the same for tackling a major stressful event in the world like this, or even daily stresses in your life. And those four building blocks is that you have some degree of technical skill, and that you have some idea of how to place your foot, for example. The next one is that you have equipment on board. And I think about those tools that we can begin to cultivate for ourselves. Equipment in this case was that I did not have trail running shoes, so I almost slid and fell at one point. We're not going to spend time on that. But that you have the equipment on board. And sometimes equipment can just be, community, and it can be support, and it could be knowing where to turn for advice or therapeutic support, those types of things. The third is that there is some level of innate ability. I will admit that I probably do not have the prototypical sense of a runner's body, and that's just not something I was built up with, but I do have innate abilities in other ways. Similarly, some people have different set points around their positive approach in life or their more negative appraisal in life. Those are just our innate abilities as they're set, but it doesn't mean that they're not capable of change. But the last thing that really helps with endurance and conditioning and building and resilience is confidence and optimism and hope, and the anticipation that you, even if it's a struggle right now, even if it's uncomfortable right now, that you will see another side on the other end of the journey, that you will make it to the end of the trail, that you will make it to your strength conditioning workout, even if they're really making you huff and puff for it, right? And so it's that mindset of how are we going to move past this experience with as many tools, skills, and abilities on board, but with this sense of hope and opportunity.
Mm-hmm. I think we have a question here.
Oh, great.
Sorry, one second. And says, I'm wondering if this pause will help people, so I think it says slow down their lives as things reopen.
Yeah. Thank you, Anne, so much for that question. I think it certainly can. I've been joking that I've been trying to make best friends with my internal introvert. So I am typically more of an extroverted type of an energy and individual, but I've really taken the moment to appreciate and take pause and make good friends with my internal introvert and recognize that there are a lot of things that I allowed me to pass by in my day-to-day. And taking a moment to appreciate what you are taking pleasure in right now with the slowing down of pace is good. I actually worry, if I'm being honest, I worry that I was talking with one of my best friends about this a week or two ago. I worry that when we come out on the other side of this, we will be so eager to resume a new normal of whatever that looks like, that we might actually lose some of the tools or new strategies or appreciations we've developed during this time for how we can be different in the world. And what I think is amazing is that this experience that is touching all of us in very profound and impactful ways, it's also teaching each one of us how we can show up differently in our worlds and our environments. And maybe it's showing us some pieces of ourselves we don't like as much or that are very challenging and concerning. It might be showing us pieces of ourselves that, when I'm not surrounded by my community all the time in the same ways, I find ways to rely upon myself to a greater degree. But either way, I hope that people are able to take stock and recognize and hopefully reflect upon or write down, take stock and recognize how they can show up differently in the world and what pieces of that do you want to carry out of this experience with you. And maybe those are gifts to yourself, and what pieces are fine being left behind, but just being very intentional about that choice and maybe building in slow down spots in the future, which we've been harping on in popular media and public discussion for years now. But now it's been a forced prescription upon us.
Yeah. I'm going to ask you like a fairly specific question on, if there's someone watching or will be watching who is kind of, hit a wall and they are just really not coping well right now.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it's depression symptoms, anxiety is out of control. What would you say are kind of like first steps for getting back, out of that? Because obviously that's a spiral, right? You could potentially spiral downward.
I want people to share their despair, is what I've been saying. I was reflecting upon that it's much easier for us to hide our pain now in some ways when we aren't having these day-to-day micro interactions where even people on the street may notice that, maybe not people on the street. I don't want people to notice on the street if I'm not smiling or not. That's a whole different set of problems. But when people in our common places of interaction, maybe they were taking daily pulse checks of us, even on a very minimal basis. And we now lose the luxury of people seeing us and saying like, hey, are you okay today? You seem a little off. Is there something that you need to talk about? Is there something weighing on your mind? Now, unless you are the one sharing that out or you're in a close home community where others are observing that in you, it means that it's so much easier to hide despair or loneliness or depression. And so I'm really encouraging people, if they're really having a tough day, to let someone know, especially if they are in a more isolated environment, to share that despair. The other thing is to, as soon as you are aware of your mood declining, hopefully if you've had experience in the past with how to manage any feelings of low mood or depression, you begin to take out those building blocks that you have used before to begin to manage those symptoms. It also will be, as I said earlier, trying out new techniques and new strategies, because this is a whole new stress load than we've ever asked people to endure before, or in a different way than what they might be used to.
Mm-hmm.
And then obviously, if it is severe or if it's such an unfamiliar sense of depression for you, because many people, myself included, have had experiences with depression episodes before, but maybe this is a whole new level to it that you've ever experienced. And if you really feel like you're getting caught in the whirlwind of depression, sorry, that's a siren. If you feel like you're getting caught in the whirlwind of depression, this is the time more than ever to go to our crisis support resources, such as national helplines, go to communities such as Made of Millions to seek peer support, and make sure that you are contacting health professionals. In particular, I want to make sure that this is really clear to health professionals that are right now on the COVID front lines. Oh no, did my video disappear?
I can still see you. It's just
okay, great. Okay, on my side, it showed a circle. But make sure that you are, if you are a working health professional on the COVID front lines, making sure that you have a chance to do mental health checkups with either colleagues or other supports. Here in the Bay Area, for example, we actually have pro bono mental health support for any healthcare professional. It was a hotline just launched last week. So that way, any healthcare professional, no matter where they fall, if they need some immediate mental health care support, there's over 400 clinicians volunteering their time right now to provide that.
Yeah.
So as soon as you notice, yeah, I mean, and I think we're going to see resources like that crop up more so if we haven't already in various pockets and communities.
Yeah. I often think of a couple of people right now, more specifically like individuals that are potentially living alone, that are very isolated, which we already touched on. And then individuals that have, a really demanding family life, as well as work pressures and financial burden and all of that. And oftentimes in those situations, they don't necessarily have the time that I might have as, someone that lives on their own, doesn't have children. Is that a case of trying to reach out for help, like in a professional capacity? What if they can't get away to do like work, to exercise or do anything physical, or, they're just kind of all consumed with family, work, and all of that?
Yeah. Everyone is going to have their own unique set of challenges, obviously, and some of them are going to have a lot of barriers in place that may make it really difficult to engage in self-care. With that said, the two micro offerings I would give is, first and foremost, what is one small thing, even as minuscule as it may seem, what is one small thing that you could do for yourself to help your overall coping or resiliency and help shore up the weak parts of your physical and mental well-being? And by weak parts, I mean like everything has tension points and periods of their life where things seem to run threadbare. And so when pieces of your life and your physical and mental health and well-being seem to be running threadbare, what is one thing you could do to help reinforce that area? And even if it is taking 5 extra minutes in the bathroom, whatever, and taking 4 deep breaths before getting up for the morning. Again, if you can do one small thing, start to breathe deeper. It truly will begin to bring down some of that stress response, that cortisol exposure you're experiencing, help provide new oxygen to your brain, and then help reduce the cortisol exposure. Those are just key things. But what is one small thing you could embed into your life that day to make you feel that you're shoring up one piece of the puzzle that might be coming a bit unraveled? The other thing is that I really want to encourage us to share openly when we are proud of an accomplishment we made that day. As much as I keep joking about my watercolor painting, I also am sharing with people, you know what, I didn't want to do this today, but I did it, and I'm actually pretty proud of myself. And I want people to applaud and appreciate amongst each other and with each other, even if it's in their home environments alone, when you do have that mark of success in a day and getting through the day. So that's really important.
Okay. I wanted to ask about, as restrictions are slowly starting to ease, we touched on this a little bit, but the anxiety now that we're going to face as we start kind of re-entering society again. I mean, I experienced it with going to my parents' house. I also experienced it walking in nature on a trail that ended up being a lot busier than I had hoped. And so a trail that I typically love was then more anxiety provoking because people weren't socially distancing, and I had my dog with me, and like that kind of stuff. So it's like there was that excitement of like, oh, I can go see my parents, I can go and walk on this trail that I normally love to do. But both experiences were met with some anxiety and like that was challenging, and I guess my thought process is we then have to again readapt to those experiences. So like we're just constantly having to shift, right?
Yeah. I so appreciate you bringing that up and asking about that, because last week my mom and I were having this conversation around, are we going to be able to trust each other again? And how do we build up social trust for each other, especially when we've become so hyper vigilant around what every single neighbor is doing around us and how people are choosing to engage in those precautionary efforts or not, right? And I'm not going to go into pandemic shaming. That's not something I'm interested in discussing today, because that has its own whole package associated with it. But
a lot of judgment.
A lot of judgment, right? Yeah, a lot of.
I mean, I'm at fault for it too.
Absolutely. Me too. I've been down the street where I will say like, why is so-and-so not wearing a mask? And I have to catch myself. And that's the biggest thing I think will be really important for us as we each are beginning to test out our social boundaries again, because that's what each one of us will be doing, is testing our social boundaries and testing our social trust in each other as communities or as neighbors or whatever it might be, or even as family members. I will also share that I had a small mini dispute with a family member around their choices that they were making initially. But what that caused me to do is to take stock and pause a moment and really evaluate, how do we begin to build back in factors of our own psychological well-being, which does involve getting out in nature, it does involve going outside, it does involve community and social support. How do we begin to build those back in, but not be so guilt-ridden, so anxious-ridden, and so punitive towards other people? And so I don't know if you saw the article, but about a week and a half ago, Dr. Julia Marcus out of the Harvard School of Medicine wrote this beautiful piece in The Atlantic that talks about how the coronavirus pandemic mirrors many aspects that we saw with the HIV epidemic. And one thing I didn't share is that actually at one point in my professional training, I was an HIV infectious disease fellow. And so oftentimes throughout this entire ordeal, I've thought back to my work when I was doing infectious disease efforts. And what I love about Dr. Marcus's piece is that she was able to articulate everything I had kind of been tumbling around in my brain. And one thing that she really suggests is, we know historically that abstinence-only policies of absolutely doing nothing and restricting people's behaviors have never been found to be successful in terms of public health initiatives for the HIV/AIDS epidemic, or as it relates to sexual transmission of various other diseases. Abstinence-only policies are usually failing all of the time because humans are going to continue to seek the pleasurable and normal behaviors that they're used to. So right now, she lays out this beautiful argument. Right now, we've set up this entire framework of us all stopping communication, or not communication, but us all stopping physical interactions as a form of an abstinence-only policy. Instead, she argues for us taking more harm reduction strategies. And this goes back to my Corona calculator I was saying earlier, right? What precautions can you take to help lessen your own personal anxiety, help you feel more confident going outside, and lessen your guilt? And also know that there will be this space of discomfort. But what you're aiming to do is reduce the likely harm you are going to cause to others, and hopefully encourage those around you that you have a relationship with, not just random people. Hopefully encourage others to then take on their precautionary efforts as well to help do harm reduction. So I think that's one way that we can begin to combat the anxiety efforts. But a lot of it will just be you challenging your own anxiety. And I don't mean you, Mary-Lyn, but each one of us. But each one of us challenging that emotional surge that we experience, right? Because what anxiety is, it's an emotion, it's an immediate emotional fear response. But if you can take a deep breath and just pause in the moment to say, is this fear rational or not? And that's a really hard question to ask. But is this fear supported right now? Is this fear going to serve me? Or can I maybe back away from this fear even just a little bit and allow it to lessen up off the gas of it taking over my experience in this moment? if you can just slow down the system even a microsecond and allow you to readjust, it will make it easier for you to go out in public, but go out in public safely.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And I think one of the biggest anxieties that I've faced is like the family thing, right? Because my family's so close to me. And so, being around them, that hyper vigilance that you talked about is going to be even higher. And so the people that you're almost willing to take a risk for, you then reevaluate and you're like, oh yeah, no, I'm actually not. So then you're left at square one.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. And I think that when we're trying to take those risk assessments with our closest people in our life that we deeply love and respect and care for, that's where the emotions will flare up all the more, right? And what I had to remind myself, so the minor dispute I had was with my mother, and I'm not going to go into her choices because this is my story, but the minor dispute I had was with my mother, and I had to take a step back and just recognize what I really needed to acknowledge is that the reason why I was reacting the way I was out of a stance of fear and concern and likely control was because I love her.
Yeah.
And when I was able to just say out loud, you know what, I'm reacting this way because I love you, it allowed the situation to completely diffuse. And then when we reapproach the conversation again as people that care for each other from a stance of care and love and support, it completely shifted the interaction and the tone of the conversation. So as each of us might be preparing to have these challenging conversations with friends and loved ones and family members, try to reset the stage if you do notice tensions heightening, that you are trying to approach this conversation from a stance of care and love and compassion. But it's hard to remind ourselves in those moments when we have such a knee-jerk fear response and fear has hijacked our brain.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And it's interesting because I think a lot of people that in my circle have had that similar discussion with parents. So it's just interesting that different generations and different people are taking things, different. They're approaching it differently. And I think one of the other key things is to be very transparent with, with those difficult conversations, so that both of you can make those right choices that you believe are right for both of you. Yeah. We're kind of coming to like the last 10 to 15 minutes here.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Thank you everyone for tuning in for what you have.
Yes.
And then thank you for such amazing questions and such a great discussion.
Yeah, no, like I said, the few times we've chatted, I've always enjoyed it. So it was great. But just to kind of like wrap it up, can we, I think just to add on, to end on some kind of takeaways for people, obviously with the work that you've done with resiliency and positive psychology, I kind of wanted to touch on that again. And obviously you'll probably repeat some of the things that you already said, but just to circle back to some coping skills or how to build that resiliency. And then also around that whole notion of like the reward system. And since we are kind of like you mentioned with your watercolor, like that's not necessarily giving you as much joy. Do you just keep going at it? Like, what's the different approach that you're taking? Do we just have to be really creative with our time when we have it,
Yeah. So there's so many pieces of that question that are rather broad.
Sorry.
It's okay. It's totally fine. Where to start? So the pieces of resiliency that are most successful is that we find time and time again that if people have about 3 different tools on board for resiliency, it really helps up the ante for them. And so one of them is taking as best as possible an optimistic framework. And it's reframing a negative situation and finding moments to recognize when there might be even a slight benefit to it for you. It doesn't mean that everything is hunky-dory in the world. It doesn't mean that things have now been painted in watercolor. I gotta stop using watercolors, but things have been painted in rainbows and sparkles, right? But it means that you're able to find something small that is of benefit to you and helps you thrive, and that's optimism. The other 2 things.
Can you give an example for that? I'll give you an example of a negative experience for me.
Sure,
like
happily.
That happened last night. I was out at probably 11 o'clock at night walking my dog because I was up late last night. And I live in Little Italy. And so one of the streets is typically like really busy and booming and exciting. And I was out there and I was like, oh my God, like there's nobody out here. Like it was just like a really sad moment of realizing, oh, like nobody's around. Everyone's at home. It's a beautiful night and no one can be out here enjoying it.
Yeah. I love that example because I've experienced that myself. And I also want to clarify that, again, it's not twisting everything to be happy and positive. It's finding positive in the midst of maybe something that could be negative as well. So similarly, I live in what used to be a thriving and business corridor in downtown San Francisco, and it's now desolate is actually the word I keep using, is that it's very quiet. Many of our storefronts are boarded up in our hotels. But when I am doing my walk at night, as unnerving as it might be with how quiet and empty it is, I've also been noticing, wow, and I can hear so much more of the city noises. And I can see what my streets have looked like in periods when there aren't people on them. Like there's a little bit of a beauty in the architecture of a city without people milling around it. And it's just trying to find micro moments of pleasure. And it doesn't mean that you need to sit on it for too long. It doesn't mean that you need to paint too broad of a brushstroke over it, but it's just taking a moment to say, what is something I could appreciate in this moment?
Yeah.
And there are going to be moments where there's nothing to appreciate. If I am being tumbled around in waves, and maybe I have gotten, because I'm a big swimmer, maybe I'm being tumbled around in waves and I got caught up in a swell, I'm not going to take a moment right then and there to find something I appreciate. What I am going to do is I'm going to get my butt to shore in some way after I've treaded water for a bit and paddled there. And then once I reach the shore, I'm going to be like, wow, I'm really proud of myself that I was a strong enough swimmer to make it here.
Right.
That's what I mean. So it's not always finding positive, but it is when there are moments for it, encouraging yourself to capture it and taking a bit of a micro pleasure in it. The other two or three pieces, my list numbers change sometimes, but the other 2 or 3 pieces is also just having curiosity. We know that when people take a curious stance for problem solving, for finding optimistic opportunities, when people are just curious about their experience or their emotional reactions, it allows them to disconnect a little bit from it for a bit more and allows them to learn. Because when we're curious, we're more apt to learning. And that's exactly what resiliency is learning new skills, tools, and strategies to make it through a hardship or a stressor. And then the other one is having support mechanisms, and that if you can rely upon some community support, in particular, again, when I say if you're isolated, if you can learn to show the concern that you're facing and really vocalize that instead of remaining silent, and you rely more upon social supports, that can be huge. And then the final piece is just for resiliency building. And I'm recognizing we're running real low on time, but the other piece for resiliency building is problem solving. So when you take a curious lens, you're able to better come up with new skills and strategies to problem solve. And that's what it is finding a new way to adapt to your changing circumstances. So that was one piece of your really broad question. What would you like me to possibly tackle?
Just on the problem solving thing, I don't think we'll be kicked off. So if we go over a few minutes, it's fine. The problem solving thing, I guess we have to be like, I know for myself, I suffer with OCD. And so my brain is one big problem solving machine, and it can get me into trouble sometimes. So I guess just to clarify that there's not an aspect of control there that we're trying to, because with OCD, oftentimes we're problem solving or we're analyzing or we're doing certain behaviors to minimize or get rid of the anxiety. So can you just give, like, coming from that standpoint, can you elaborate on what you mean by problem solving as it relates to this?
That's a really great question. So problem solving is when each of us have taken up a new strategy during Corona. Maybe it's setting up a new ritual for yourself. Maybe it is taking your dog on walks. Those are all micro attempts to problem solve and find new ways to cope, right? Another form of problem solving that people are less associated with is also taking no action. Sometimes taking no action instead of our desperate attempt to throw everything at the wall and see what sticks. Sometimes that's just taking a step back and sitting in discomfort, as you and I have talked about now a few different times, sitting in discomfort and taking no immediate action to control or address and fix. That also can be a problem-solving strategy because it recognizes that no action is just as valuable of a tool, sometimes as valuable as a tool as every other attempt to fix can be. So every time you are trying out a new strategy or a strategy that you know works for you, that is a form of problem solving. and including sometimes taking no action in attempts to control. Does that better?
Okay. Yeah, totally. Yeah. I love that you understand my random thoughts that come through my head.
I get the opportunity to translate for people from a wide swath of backgrounds and experiences, because so many people have trouble articulating themselves and labeling their experience. And my job is to be a professional translator of people's internal experiences.
Yeah.
And so, it's fun.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. I guess, the last part of that big, broad question, just around the reward system. I mean, that's selfish of me because I think that is really interesting. So, you talked about the building the resiliency, and that to me, I look at as more of like a tool set kind of approach. I don't know if you'd agree with calling it that, but then with the reward system and doing very specific activities or self-care activities or whatever it is, finding different outlets. If we keep hitting walls where we're like, oh, that's no longer bringing me as much joy, I'm kind of bored with that, like my brain's no longer being challenged or whatever it is, what do we do with that?
Yeah, the vast majority of people actually enjoy being productive in some form, and productive can take a wide variety of meanings and definitions. So I don't mean that it has to be a monetary productive value, such as I go to a job and I get a paycheck, right? But the vast majority of people are driven to create some type of change in their day-to-day. It helps shake things up. It helps provide some level of novelty for themselves. It's just interesting. It's a more interesting life. So when we are met with the same reward time and time again of watching, I'm going to use a personal example of watching Insecure on HBO. When we are drawn to the same reward system time and time again, eventually we all will kind of fry out on that reward system. There's a reason why binge TV, when people are binge watching shows or entertainment, that after a while they're kind of like, okay, I'm bored of this. Our brain does get bored.
Yeah.
So what we can be, wait, how do I want to spend my energies? What is the new thing that might provide me a little bit of joy and stimulus? And then I can come back to the thing I already know. So for now, you asked me earlier, like, what am I doing with my watercolors? I decided after last week, I'm done for a bit of time. I'm going to take a break. But what I do already know is that it is a way for me to decompress, relax, and find enjoyment. I just did too much of it. And so once I'm going to take a break from that, I'm going to go try trail running for a bit. I'm going to invest in some new books I just got. I'm going to build in other reward mechanisms. And that way I can rotate through them. And we've used the analogy before. Some of my psychology mentors in the past, and an analogy I use with patients on a regular basis, is that our brain goes through a Rolodex in our head, which is a really antiquated way of saying it goes through a list of various photos in our head of things that brought us joy. And then when we find that that thing is no longer working for us, it keeps scrolling to the next thing that brought us joy. So as many different photos or contact cards or methods of enjoyment that our brain can begin to rely upon, if we don't like the first 5 options, we can move to number 6, 7, and 8, and 9, and so forth. So you finding and exploring new things that bring you even micro moments of joy is really important, because then you can train your brain to go back to it at a later point when the first 5 ones have run their course for that time being.
And I think, I know at least in my recovery with OCD and different therapies I've done is really looking at my value system and what I value. And so once you've kind of outlined and identified what you value, then it's a bit easier, I guess, to figure out where to spend your time and energy. Some of that's being challenged again right now, because one of my biggest things I value is family and connection with humans, to be honest. So that's challenging, but I'm finding ways around that with just connecting over screens, which is great fun. But yeah, I mean, other things like I value being healthy, and so that's why I do the working out, and I value my mental health as well, which is why I do the working out, and I value my dog, and so I take her for a walk, even just simple things like that, right? And so that way you can be a bit more creative in, like, even with the watercolor, like you value being creative, and so if the watercolor is no longer exciting, then you can find another creative outlet.
And I'm so glad you brought the focus back to value systems, because it's remarkably enough, I've talked about value systems 3 different times in the last week and a half with various sorts of friends and colleagues. And we've been talking really closely around, this is the time to, I think this is a time for people to better identify what are their values and what are values that they have better contact with right now and what are values that they don't. And for those who are unaware, we use a lot of fluffy terms to describe values, but values are ideologies that are usually intangible, but ideologies that really are your North Star and guiding compass. They're not goals. A goal might be that I am able to successfully run a 5-mile trail, right? But my value to meet that goal, my value is that I enjoy time outside and that I also enjoy physical health and well-being. And so this is the life of Corona. This is the life of us being in our actual homes. No apologies needed.
Don't mind me. Okay.
What a very cute dog. No, but what's important with our value systems is finding out, I love that you said, like, my value is creativity, and watercolor was getting it at one angle, but that doesn't mean that's the only angle to still get at that value. And I also appreciate that you said this thing around energy reserves, because our values can sometimes be energy fulfilling. And if we are spending our time and efforts in ways that are not value driven, we usually will notice energy crashes happening. And with one of my best friends, she made this really great comment when we were on the phone 2 weeks ago about how people should be really thoughtful about their energy expenditures these days. And that oftentimes people suck at modulating their energy. They suck at overextending themselves too much for others or underestimating their actual needs or their energy resupply needs. And so if you're not being really thoughtful about energy expenditure right now, and you should be, you're going to find yourself more prepared to set up and crash. And it's going to be harder because, again, we don't have our normal mechanisms available to us. So be thoughtful about identifying what your values are and how you want to redirect your energy appropriately to meeting those values. And when one mechanism to meet that value is no longer enjoyable, rewarding, fulfilling, whatever, find a new route to that same value.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, like, for myself, again, one of my biggest values is people and my relationships. And so if I value that, I have to look after myself. And so if it means like having a really chill day, like, it can come back to really basics. It doesn't mean, like you said, you have to like have all these productive things on a day or have all these goals. It's just like, what do I value and where do I want to spend my time and what's most important to me? And that way you can set boundaries around that as well.
Boundary setting right now is also as important as making yourself available. Being connected is
the
just
boundaries. The boundaries conversations.
That's a whole nother fireside chat.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I'll just say quickly, like, I didn't even know really what boundaries were until like 2 years ago. And it's really been a massive, interesting education for myself and has helped me a lot in like just even like loving myself more and putting myself first. And anyway, that's a whole other conversation.
But I'm again, boundaries, just because our world, let's take 30 seconds to pause on that one. I appreciate that. Just because so much has become reshuffled for us and we're trying every way that we can to reconnect with people and stay invested and stay attuned to what's happening, also establishing boundaries for yourself when you are inaccessible is still just as important as it was before. And you and I had a conversation, right, where I have actually very purposely done disconnect days where I shut down all of my screen interactions with people for a day, because that is something I also need. This is where I talk about meeting my inner introvert where she's at. That's also something I need, that as much as I am appreciating being with others despite isolation efforts, through social media and Zoom and what have you, that it's still important for me to preserve my energy by not being constantly available to people or not getting fatigued by looking at video screens all day, because it is really hard. We have lots of evidence now showing it is literally exhausting on your brain to maintain eye contact with a small pinhole camera, and you don't get any of the other normal response feedback that you're used to make a social exchange engaging and important to you. So that's tiring. So allowing yourself to have boundaries and disconnect when needed too is important still, despite everything going on. So thank you for bringing that to the forefront.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I guess we'll wrap it up here, but for those that tuned in, thank you so much. And this will be on our site. So for people out there Googling quarantine fatigue, they'll be tuning in. And where can people find you?
Yeah, so my biggest presence right now is on LinkedIn under Dr. Brittany Linton, PhD. Please feel free to find me there and connect. The other thing I just did as of a few hours ago, because at the behest of my friend here, I finally secured a Twitter handle. So you can find me at at Dr._Brittany. I don't even know my own Twitter handle. But you can find me there. I am now doing a better job of being socially present. So if you want to be some of my handful of first followers, please do. But LinkedIn is the best avenue for right now, and then Twitter in the next few days. Maybe I'll post my Corona calculator there. I'm gonna post my.
I like
that will be my first post.
Yeah, okay. And also that article that you mentioned, the Harvard Business Review article. That sounds really interesting.
Yes. So follow me on Twitter for my first 2 posts. You'll be very lucky.
All right, amazing. Well, thank you so much for your time, and maybe we can do another one of these soon. And yeah, I guess we'll leave it at that. And again, for the audience, if you have any questions that come up later, you can reach out to Brittany, Dr. Brittany, or myself. And yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. And please do everything you can to keep your health and well-being at the forefront.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.